Hello, everyone. Welcome to what I realised is our 40th webinar since we started this series back in September 2020. I'm Christina Silva. I manage the QDAS networking project that organises these events, and we're based in the Department of Sociology at the University of Surrey in Guildford, which is about an hour to the west of London. I work with Sarah Bullock, my close colleague and friend, who you can see up there on the screen. Unfortunately, she can't be with us today. This webinar today is in our methodology stream, where we focus on methods-related applications of the use of digital tools for qualitative and mixed methods analysis. And I will introduce our speakers to you very briefly, very shortly. But first of all, I just briefly want to let you know that we've already got a couple of webinars scheduled for the new academic year. 1st of September, we're going to be talking about what is for some quite a hot topic at the moment, generative AI in qualitative analysis, thinking about whether this is a significant step change or it's a little bit of a bandwagon topic. So do join us for that if you're interested in those developments. And then later on in October, we'll be coming back to a similar topic to what we're focusing on today, thinking about coding with interrogation of your data and patterns in mind. So that's a couple that we've already got scheduled. Okay, so let's get on to the business of the day. I'm delighted to welcome two of my colleagues here today. Dr. Michelle Salmona and Dr. Sarah Grummert, who are going to speak to us today on best practices for coding in teams in qualitative and mixed methods projects. Let me tell you a little bit about each of them before they get going. So first of all, Michelle is president of the Institute of Mixed Methods Research, which she co-founded in 2016. And she's also got an academic appointment as adjunct professor at the University of Canberra in Australia. She spends half her time over in Australia and the rest of her time in the US. Michelle's got a long-standing interest in and experience with qualitative software programs, including NVivo and Dedoose. And she's written many books and loads of papers and other publications around these sorts of topics, including a co-authored book on Dedoose specifically. I'll drop the link into the chat later on. And also a new book on qualitative research writing, which I think is about to be published, not quite out yet.
Working on the proofs now. Yeah,
working on the proofs now. So that's something exciting to keep your eyes out for. In addition, she's a senior fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy and also a credentialed project management professional. So Michelle specialised in qualitative and mixed methods research design and analysis, and her own research focuses on how to better understand and support doctoral success to strengthen the research process, as well as to build data-driven decision-making capacity through technological innovation. So the relationship between methods and technologies is something that I think you've focused quite a lot on in your career, Michelle, which many of you who know me know that that's also something I'm very interested in. So that's a little bit about Michelle. Dr. Sarah Grummert holds a dual appointment with the Institute of Mixed Methods Research, where she works closely with Michelle, and also at Dedoose. Her role within the Institute is around leading strategy about how to support academic and research communities around the world through data analysis and writing seminars, methods consultations and training workshops, as well as partnering with scholars on research design, data collection and analysis through various different avenues. Sarah's role with Dedoose is also around strategy, but this time around supporting the research community, around creating learning resources to enable software and the Dedoose application particularly to be harnessed in the way that makes sense for all of us doing our own individual projects. Sarah earned her doctorate at the University of California, Riverside in the field of higher education administration and policy, and she used Dedoose for that project. Additionally, Sarah is a senior research associate for the Center of Athlete Rights and Equity at the University of California, Riverside, where she also teaches courses related to research methods and higher education. So lots of intersections between teaching, learning, digital tools and methods, which I'm very excited about. So I will hand over to you and give the floor to you, and very much look forward to hearing all about best practices for coding.
Thank you. What an introduction. I'm not used to getting the full treatment. So thank you, Christina. I'll share my screen here. And for folks who came a little bit earlier, you've seen this question. We're not going to spend too much time on this slide, but as you're in the chat today and as we're getting going, please put any challenges or topics that you're interested in when it comes to coding in a team in the chat. Very curious what everyone in this community is dealing with on a daily basis, because I know I included one of my challenges that I'm going to be talking about today.
It's a huge topic and we're going to touch on a few elements of it, but hopefully we can just sort of get the conversation started today.
Mm-hmm. And also feel free to put any questions in the chat too. I'm sure Christina will be watching, but I'll also be keeping an eye on the chat. Christina did such a lovely job. I don't think we need to reintroduce ourselves, so thank you again. Michelle, you may just want to highlight a couple things you have going on.
No, I'm fine. I think Chris
did
a great job.
I will say I have a chapter coming out soon. It's based around video data, but we touch, well, I would say we write heavily about the topic of collaboration and staying away from inter-rater reliability scores. So if you're interested in a preprint of that chapter and some of the topics that I talk about today, feel free to grab my email after we're done today and we can communicate about that. All right, so today, I know we only have an hour. We're going to try to cover a lot because we are passionate about this topic. We're going to start off with barriers to adopting digital tools in general, go over some team processes, especially as it relates to coding. So codebook management, how to evaluate agreement between multiple coders. I'm going to give my spiel and cautions on an IRR score for gauging reliability. And then we're also going to hop into Dedoose and talk about a couple different ways you can use Dedoose to really enhance your research with a team. All right, so first off, barriers to successful adoption of technology.
I wanted to talk about this today because I wanted to bring into the conversation this idea of getting everybody into the same place. When you're working in a team, you're working with lots of different people coming from lots of different backgrounds. And in qualitative research, that can bring in some really interesting issues around misconceptions, lack of shared understandings, how do you find shared understandings, those types of things. So this idea of misconceptions is something to just have front of mind as we go through today. So if we go to the next slide, this was a paper I did, it's quite a while ago now, but the idea of barriers to successful technology adoption. So when people are using technology, digital tools in their research, we worked out in our paper that there are two barriers in this to get people to be successful. Now, the first one, barrier one, is kind of, the bleeding obvious. This idea that if they find they perceive it to be useful and they perceive it to be easy to use, then they're going to be fine. But then there's this idea about intention to use, which is the second barrier, which is understanding that the software isn't there to actually do the work for you. It's a tool that you can use. What you need to be really clear about is what conceptually is going on in your research. What is the methodology about? What is your theoretical orientation? What is the actual focus of your study? And I think even when you're coding in teams, team members need to have this overarching understanding of what the project's about. It's very hard to get team members to sort of code in isolation. So with this idea of barriers to successful technology adoption, just keep in mind this idea that if you're working with a team who actually understands what the project's about, you're going to be likely to be much more successful than if you just get some coders to just sort of code in isolation and not really understand the focus of the study or where they're going. So this is starting this idea of the conversation around how do you build a successful team. So if we move on to the next slide, the first idea about working in teams is processes for teams themselves. So how do you have a successful team? These are just some ideas that we put up. I don't know that it's not a complete list, but it's some spaces to get started. As you're working in a team, you need to be organized. And that's just not the team leader themselves need to be organized, but everybody within the team themselves needs to be organized. So this idea of having strong communication channels, and there's a place in Dedoose where you can have, for example, team communication memos, where you can actually communicate within the application itself, can work quite well. It doesn't matter how you do it, but you need to have this strong communication processes in place. Deadlines. People often forget about this idea of deadlines, but team members need to have deadlines and they need to be held accountable to them. So you need to have processes around that, which are, well, if we've got a deadline to meet, but someone's not going to meet that deadline, how can they bring that to the team and come up with ways around that of managing? Do we need to put more resources in there to get to the deadline? Why are we not going to meet this deadline? Really understand what's going on with the processes. Obviously, fix your obvious problems, but document the progress as you go. Work out what's going well, what's not going well. Think about what's going on behind the scenes. And this idea of having a process in place for major team decisions, I think, is really important. Rather than it just being seen the team leader just makes random decisions, get people to be involved. Get some process in place for people to actually be able to speak up, because everybody is valuable in a team. It doesn't matter about their level of experience, their level of expertise. People bring value to a team. Otherwise, they wouldn't be a member of the team. So have a process in place to allow people to speak up and be heard.
And I'll say it seems to me that having these processes in place appears to be a bit easier if it's structured in the academic environment and you have students working on your team. But then if you're collaborating with other researchers who have their PhDs or just research professionals, maybe there's a little hesitation to put strict deadlines in place because you assume we're all professionals and we don't need these guidelines. So I really like this reminder that no matter what, if you're working in a team, you need to have this checklist and these processes.
So let's talk about this specifically with project teams. It's essential that you have a team leader. That may be the PI. If it's a grant, it may not. It probably needs to be someone who is good at meeting deadlines and managing processes and has the time and space to be a team leader. Separately, when we're talking about coding, you need to have a code manager. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide, but someone who's responsible for the code tree itself. For the team, make sure that the goals are clear. So when you're working on a project, people not only need to understand what the project's about, but they need to understand what they're working towards. Can't emphasize planning enough. When you think you've done enough planning, you probably need to do some more. But get people involved in the planning. Try not to plan in isolations. This idea of emphasis on solving problems rather than deciding on blame is about creating a positive culture within the team. Things will go wrong. That's not Murphy's Law. It's the truth. Things will go wrong. So you need to have a process in place to manage that. How do you solve the problem? Who's involved in solving the problem? What are the processes? This next point about understanding roles is, I think, essential. People need to understand where they fit. They need to understand what value they bring to the team, and they need to understand what's the point of their role. If you're just having someone coding and they don't really understand what they're coding for or what they're coding towards, it's going to be not as strong a process as if they were actually clear about what they're trying to achieve. And one of the things that I've often found quite helpful is this idea of involving team members in setting expectations. That way people actually take some ownership of the process rather than being told what to do. They're involved in setting their expectations of the group as a whole. And so that in that process, they're going to understand more of what you're trying to achieve in the team. So, codebook management. Again, the goal for your team is to have a successful team and an efficient codebook. If you're working on your own, trying to build a codebook, it's much easier. You don't need to think about so much about misconceptions, shared understandings, those types of things. You just code. But when you're working with others to build a codebook, you need to have procedures in place. So formal communication rules, they don't have to be like a communication plan that's 50 pages long with masses of code charts and, flow charts and things like that. But you need to have rules in place, just some key rules about how do people communicate. So if I'm working on a team and I'm just coding for that team, I want to know if something happens and I need to speak up, how can I do that? Procedures for flexible emergent design issues. This is nice to think about being systematic in your approach. So when you're going to be producing your artifact from the research, you want to be able to tell the story of how you actually work through the process of the analysis. So capturing those flexible emergent design issues as they occur can be very helpful. My personal view is only the code manager makes changes to the code. So you need to have protocols for creating codes and managing codes. So the codebook manager would be someone who would be in charge of the code tree itself. They would be the person who would make sure the code definitions are all complete and clear. Their role would be to build shared understandings in the team of the definitions for the codes. How much context is needed around those codes, for example. So you're going to be coding at the word level, at the phrase level, at the sentence level, at the paragraph level, that type of thing. Deadlines again, but this idea of when you're getting team members to code, you have an existing code tree that they can code to, and that's fine. But what happens when they find something that isn't in the code tree? What is your protocol there for managing those codes? So on a personal note, I would have a separate code tree created that would be called codes to be discussed. People would be able to code at a new code, and at the next codebook meeting, you'd be able to talk about those new codes. Are they going to be moved into the codebook? Are they going to be merged with existing codes? Are they going to be kept for later because they're not really part of the focus of the study? That type of discussion needs to happen on a regular basis to keep building that codebook. I can see there's a lot of comments going on. I'm not following the chat while I'm talking.
Yeah,
so
I have one that I want to highlight here. So a question is it recommended that the code manager is different from the team leader? If we have limited team members, is one person able to take on both roles?
Sure.
Yeah.
But I think the team leader, it's a different role and needs to be clarified as a different role, but there's no reason why the same person can't wear two hats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, often I'm not working in a team larger than 3 people regularly on research. So your team may be a two-person team.
So what we've got next is some tips and guidelines for codebook management. These are 7 steps that I've put together just to develop a strong and robust coding tree. This idea of keeping code names short and relevant, I think that's very important. You don't want to have long names in the code tree, but sometimes when you're coding, you don't know what to name it. Sometimes you know it's an idea that you want to capture, but you don't know how to name it. So it's okay to give it a long name in the short term, but just bear in mind you'll need to revisit and rename it when you can name it. And it may be that the long name becomes part of the code description. So don't lose what you're coding, just bear in mind that you may need to come back to it. Don't force codes into a hierarchy. It's okay to have concepts at the top level. It doesn't need to be a lovely tidy tree with one grandparent, parents and children. There may be multiple parts to the tree. Separate your thematic codes from other code groupings. This is this idea of having project management coding in this example might be this idea of codes to be discussed at a later date will be in a separate part of a separate code tree. You might want to have theoretical codes in a separate code tree. It really depends what your coding is about. But just remember the code tree is a great place to actually manage code groupings. And make sure a code only appears once. So, for example, if you're coding benefits and you've got benefits for program A and benefits for program B, keep them only code one code called benefits, one code called program A, and one code called program B, because you can always code multiple codes to different pieces of the text. And you then use your visualization tools to be able to see the intersection of where are the benefits for program A and where are the benefits of program B. You'll be able to do that with a chart, a visualization tool. Do not combine multiple concepts into one code. So skeptical attitudes and government policies need to be two separate codes. Oh, my little red thing slipped. It needs to be. So the little red downward thumb needs to be next to the first one, which is code A, and skeptical attitudes about government policy. That's not, you don't want to do that one. You want to have them as two separate codes. Keep a code decision log. I think this is quite important. It's a form of memoing, if you like, capturing changes to the code book, connection to analysis, how you're organizing things. You're trying to capture the process of your analysis so that when you go to write it up, you can recreate your thinking as it developed. And then assess your codes regularly, merge, reorganize, rename, make sure your definitions are all there. Definitions are really, really important. Often people will code and they won't bother to actually put in detailed definitions, but definitions that are written in accessible language to all, so no shortcuts, no special acronyms, just make the definition easy to read, will allow people who are coding in the team to remind themselves what that code's actually about and what it's trying to capture. So any questions or thoughts?
Yeah, we can pause and check the chat here. I just wanted to also add a common question we receive is, how long should my code book be? Or how many codes is too many codes? I always like to take a step back and think of it in terms of the credibility and trustworthiness of your study and how many concepts can you actually hold in your head at once. So if you're coding a piece of text and you have 200 codes, it's highly unlikely that you're going to remember 200 distinct concepts and be able to choose which one. So that's a good reframing to think about if you have too many codes, and maybe you take a step back and think about your research purpose and focus and which codes are actually helping your analysis. If you find that you're having too many codes, also pause and think about if you're actually writing memos instead of codes.
You want to talk a little bit more about that? Oh, we have a question from Christina.
There was a follow-up question from an earlier question that you answered around the code book. So I've encountered being very granular in coding, and this results in very extended code trees, which results in a lot of cleaning. Do you have any tips around how to handle that?
Well, to me, the biggest, most important step I can take is disconnecting from the digital tool and allowing my brain to function separately. So from time to time, what I would do is I would export the code book and the definitions and take the paper with me and go and sit elsewhere disconnected and uninterrupted and allow myself to just see what's going on in front of me, because often we do become so focused on the process that we just keep going down rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole without realizing, A, we've moved away from the focus of the study, and B, there's duplication. There's the code book is not efficient anymore. So the first step to look at is where's the duplication? Are there similarities? A simple step can be to look at the number of excerpts at each code. So if I've got multiple codes with a dozen excerpts, but I've got one code with 90 in it, 90 instances of coding, I'm going to want to look at that and see, well, there's obviously more going on in there. But if I've got multiple codes with only one instance of coding, I'm going to be looking at, well, are these similar concepts? What, are they things that are actually important? Just because there's only one instance of coding in a code, it doesn't mean discard it straight away, but it does mean give it a hard look and see what's going on. There's no easy way to do this, right? Coding is something that is an iterative process, which makes it challenging to do it as a team, because team members need to be connected to that iterative process. They need to understand how the code book is developing. They need to understand the focus of the study. So there's some strength in the coding by multiple coders. People often talk about the Cohen's kappa and all different ways of measuring that strength, but I think you can measure that type of strength in coding through the processes you use to share those understandings.
And we did have another good follow-up question of, well, what should be the least amount of codes or the most amount of codes? I'd say it always is dependent on your project and your team. So maybe have that conversation with your team. Can your team keep over 100 distinct concepts clearly defined and distinguished between one another? I would find it really difficult to go above 60 personally with the teams I've worked on. It also matters if you have codes nested under others. So if you're subcoding, perhaps in your original code book, you had 20, broad topical codes, but then your team goes back in and subcodes each of those topical codes to get some nuance. So then you may build out your code book to be more lengthy. I'm sorry I don't have an actual answer for you because it is dependent on your project.
I think the key here is to understand that there are really no shortcuts to this. As a researcher, part of the research team, you need to be close to your data and get a feel for what feels right. Are you capturing the essence of what's there? And also be clear that I think missing presence can be just as important as absence. So there may be concepts that you're looking for that aren't there, and that may be just as important. So I think that's why it's important as a group to sometimes just move away from the computer and just review the code book and see, can you see obvious instances of duplication or similarities, and start there.
And Christina just linked a blog post that she created on that exact topic. I'm going to check that out too.
I'm just going to question, what if only two people work as a team, but they code differently?
I think, as we move on, I think our next topic is based around that. So we'll circle back to that question.
I'm actually interested. When you say code differently, what do you mean? That would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So this next idea we wanted to bring up is this idea of memos. I'm talking about memos and more memos. Data triangulation is a visual that I created quite a while ago now. Most people seem to be comfortable with this idea of interviews, less comfortable with field notes and observation, and even less often using site documents. But the one in the middle is the one that we're really interested in today, this idea of memos. Because I think when you're coding as a group, memos can be really helpful. And there can be different ways you structure your memos, but we can talk about a few examples here. The first question to sort of ask yourself as a group is, why would I need to use memos? Now, memos can be used for capturing the reflexive memos. So you as the researcher, as instrument, are seeing things that reflect who you are and what you bring to the research, and you want to capture that. So you might write a reflective memo. An analytic memo is capturing the process of the analysis. This can be really helpful as a team, because if you find something that says not part of a code tree and you capture a new code, you may want to write an analytic memo explaining where this code's come from and how you see it as important to the focus of the study, and how you've defined it in addition to the code description itself, just so that it's more accessible to your other team members. Methods memos are usually written sort of earlier on, which is when you're actually doing the research design, deciding how you're going to develop the research methods, the data gathering methods. There's just everything is how do you build those links between the purpose and focus of your study, the research questions themselves, the theoretical orientation of your study. How do they all work together? And methods memos can capture that developing thinking. And then this fourth one, this idea of code development memos. It's part, I highlighted that a little bit when I was talking about analytical memos, but this code development memos can be really important team communication. So, for example, after a team meeting with the code master, a code development memo can capture what decisions were made at that meeting, the thinking behind those decisions, how they're going to work going forward. Different ways of capturing that can really help everyone in the team understand and feel connected to the research process itself. Any thoughts on that? Does anybody? Okay, so this is different types of memos. We have 4 of them in the book, and the 5th one, the code development memo, we added for this team communication workshop. So this just gives you some ideas of different ways of capturing your developing thinking as you go through the research. Bearing in mind this is not prescriptive. You don't have to do it this way. As a team, you can come up with your own groupings. What works for your team? And I think that's the key here. Every team's going to be different. If it's a team of 2 or a team of 10 or a team of 50, every team's going to have different inner workings. And the processes you put in place have to work for that team. These are just some ideas that we've put forward of a way of capturing ideas as they develop. Personally, I like the inductive deductive shifts idea at the end. I think the last grouping, those types of memos, I find really helpful. I think naturally we're all deductive in a way, and we work towards being inductive, particularly in qualitative research, trying to uncover a better understanding. But I find it really important to think about, when am I actually being inductive and when am I being deductive? Because sometimes it can be intentional and sometimes it can be unintentional, but capturing that really helps me with my developing thinking when I'm working through my analysis. So those are the different types of memos we use when working in a team. I don't know if anybody has any comments or thoughts. I'd like to go back to the question in the chat. I thought that was quite an interesting question. They're saying it's a team of 2 people working in a group, using different themes while using thematic analysis. To me, the themes are something that emerge through the analysis rather than using them to do the analysis. So are you asking if you're using a different approach to coding while you do your coding? So you're using different code trees, or it was still a little bit unclear. Okay, so it's going to make it quite tricky if you're using different code trees, because you're not sharing your understanding of what you're actually doing. I'm not sure if Sarah's got something she wants to add to that.
Yeah, I would just find it really difficult to have consistency across the project if your coding is that separate from one another.
It's almost as if you're doing 2 separate, you may as well be in separate projects. Okay, so a recommended approach to organizing your memos. I can tell you what I do, and that's I name all my memos in a way that helps me find them again. So I'm a great believer in having a strong naming convention when working in a team. So, for example, if I'm working with memos, I would have all my memo documents would start with MEM for memo. There would be an underscore, and then I do CD for code development memo, or M or R, whichever type of memo it was, underscore, and then I'd write 4 or 5 words about what the memo was about. That way I can actually come back later and find the memo I'm looking for from the name of it. I obviously like this type of approach because it works well for my brain, but I don't know if Christina and Sarah use different ways of organizing their memos.
That's where I find digital tools so helpful, because they make them so easy to categorize them into groups, and we can show that at the end today.
You might want to have a team communication group of memos, that type of thing. Do you have any additional resources on reflective memos? I think reflective memos can be whatever you want them to be. It's a way of capturing your own personal reflection so that they're quite personal. I think a reflective memo, it's about who you are and what you bring to the research. So as you're writing a reflective memo, you're considering where you sit in the research, the sum of all your experiences, basically who you are and what you bring. I hope that's answered the question there. We will go into memos a little bit more in Dedoose shortly, but I'm going to hand over to Sarah now for.
And I think this brief couple of slides that we're talking about next may help you think more about, if you are working in a team and you're coding differently, perhaps how to address that or evaluate that. But everything we've talked about previously related to having team processes in place, having processes for code book management, who's the code manager, memos, always be memoing. All of that can help build trustworthiness in your study. So there are so many different ways to document that you've built trustworthiness and credibility throughout your research process. But I wanted to hit on this point, especially if you're using digital tools. It seems that no matter which one you're using, they're emphasizing a more quantitative approach to gauging agreeability between multiple coders. And I really want to caution against that. And I think this is tied to, I don't know if it's the rise of the term inter-rater reliability or if it's always been around. I'm still digging into the literature. But that term, if you really think about it, comes from quantitative methods, and I believe survey design, and gauging the credibility of ratings on surveys. So it's not necessarily something that should be applied to qualitative research. When you rely on this measure or this statistic, often it's Cohen's kappa, you're missing out on a lot of generative conversations if you were to evaluate your agreement in a more qualitative way. And we can talk through some examples of what that would mean. I'm happy to provide more resources on this as well, but just really wanted to provide a caution of using a quantitative statistic to measure a qualitative process. So that's again why memoing is so important. Yes, and the comment of intercoder agreement rate is also used on quant content analysis. Absolutely. So just a couple considerations for you here if you're trying to evaluate agreement between multiple coders. And this would be something that would happen during those code development meetings or your team meetings where you're reviewing your code applications, any suggestions for new codes. Really be thinking through your rationale for why you applied that code to that excerpt, if you will, to use Dedoose terminology. And if it fits into the focus of your analysis. One thing that always gets lost if you're using a quantitative measure for agreement is the size of the excerpt and also what code co-occurrences mean to your project. So I'm not aware of any tool that can currently capture the size of the excerpt. You're obviously losing the context of the original source material that excerpt comes from. And those lead to really, really meaningful conversations about your analysis. If one person is coding 3 words and you're coding 3 sentences, that drastically changes the focus of your project. Also with code co-occurrences, this draws back to what Michelle was speaking about with not having codes that are either overly specific or capturing 2 concepts in one. So often it's nice to have a meeting to review your code co-occurrences and what that's pointing to in your research. So perhaps the co-occurrence of these two codes are pointing you to a larger theme in your study, for example. Can't talk enough about memos, but I think we've almost saturated the memo talk today. And then also a code decision log that can build trustworthiness in your study. So documenting why you made the changes to the code book that you did, who suggested the change, and when you actually made that change can be really helpful.
Well, what we're talking about here is the idea that there are different ways to build trustworthiness in your study findings. And we have a lot of, it's a never-ending discussion, but inter-rater reliability is not the only way to show that your study and your team processes have been strong and robust. So, a code decision log could be attached as an appendix, for example. You can have different tables showing, connecting your data to your research questions, to your findings, or different tables showing different things in your study that you've collected as you go through. I think it's important to understand that you need to expand your thinking as in the team to think, how can we show that we've done a strong and robust work as a team?
I will say those tools can be helpful as like a snapshot gauge of where you may be off from your other collaborators, but just reporting it on its own doesn't really mean much, right? So they can be used as helpful tools to scaffold those conversations. If we run a test between Michelle and I and see that we're interpreting something very differently, we could return back to those excerpts and talk about them. In terms of Dedoose specifically, this is taken from Michelle's textbook on Dedoose. They're really set up for three methods of evaluating reliability between multiple coders. One is called blind coding. They're transitioning to collaborative coding, so coding the exact same document and then comparing between multiple people. You can also code in parallel. So if you have two different documents, you can clone them and you can each code them separately and then compare. And then, of course, there is the IRR test that you can run. And again, I find this helpful if you already have an established code book. I saw someone in the chat talking about they bring people into code when it's a more deductive analysis and they already have their code book established. So that can be a good tool to train someone up on your code book.
I really like the middle one, particularly the coding in parallel, where you can have separate versions of the document available for a side-by-side comparison. I think that can be a great learning tool for when you're coding in teams. You can actually do a direct comparison to how you coded a document, which can be really helpful.
And I think we're ready to go into Dedoose. Does anyone else have questions about IRR? There's some good resources in the chat popping up. If not, we're going to hop into Dedoose and just show you a couple of these different methods we outlined here. I think we actually should start with memos because we've had such a good conversation about them. So if you're new to Dedoose, we can send you resources to get you oriented here. I know it can be overwhelming if you're new to a tool about where you are. But I want to highlight this memos workspace here. And this is an example of how you can categorize memos. So we have our code development, our inductive, deductive shifts, analytic memos, etc. So you can write these memos, create a new one. You can do this as you're actively analyzing the document. So as you're deep in analysis, if you have a question about a code application, for example, you can type that memo, attach it to that excerpt, that document text, tag it with that code group. And then during your team meetings, you can come in here and isolate just those memos related to code development and move through them.
You can also have just a group of memos called team communication, which can be a great way for you to say, as I finish my coding today, I'm going to write a memo for the group saying this is what I managed to achieve today, to help everybody else in the group understand what you've completed. That can be very useful.
And for those in the chat asking for a resource to get started with Dedoose, I put a little link in the chat that I think will be helpful for you. The other thing I want to highlight here is a more collaborative approach to coding where you're coding the exact same document. Because Dedoose is cloud-based, you can have multiple people in the project at once and you can code the exact same document. I just want to go over how you would accomplish that real quick. So in your security workspace, so I'm loaded up a project here called collaboration. If I wanted to add someone else to the project, you can do that via the security workspace. There are different groups that you can put people in if you're worried they may delete the whole project or something like that, which is very hard to do in Dedoose. You can put them in a different security group. But you would just select add user, choose which group you want them in, type in their email, and then they'd receive an invitation to the project and you can begin collaborating right away. Whenever you want to collaborate or code the exact same document as someone else and you don't want to see their work, so if you do want to code in isolation, you can go to your datasets workspace, and this is, you can think of it as just a huge area with a bunch of advanced filtering tools. And one of those filtering options is by users. So I could deactivate everybody else and then just choose myself so that when I go back into the transcript that we're coding, I would only see my work. So here I'm only seeing Sarah from INMR.
That's a great tool to use when working in teams, so that if someone's going off and doing some coding, they can filter out all the noise and just focus on what they're doing today, right now, by themselves, which is very helpful.
And then if you wanted to do a quick comparison, oh, I wonder if anyone else coded this passage, you can always hit the little filter icon in the upper right, and then it'll show you anyone else who coded. So here we have Delphine who coded the top 2 lines, and Sarah coded, looks like 3 to 4 sentences. So we would want to have a conversation about that, right?
That's a direct comparison within the document, which was different to what we were talking about before, which was separate clone documents side by side.
Yeah, so you can also clone the document. If you go to the edit media settings here, there's an option to clone that media. So this is if you wanted each person to have their own separate document, and then you could compare them within Dedoose if you wanted to, or print them out, bring it to your code development meeting. I always recommend coding the exact same document just because that is one of the benefits that you can do in Dedoose. You don't have to worry about merging documents or projects.
So you have the option of creating a document with excerpts and cloning that, so everyone's having a go at coding the same document with the same excerpts, or you have the option to clone it as a clean document, and then you can compare what sort of excerpts people are creating side by side, as well as coding.
And then even after all of my bashing on IRR, I do want to show you there's a training center where you can create a test. And again, this is great for training someone up on your code book because you could create a test. You can choose which excerpts and which codes you want to include in that test. And then someone could come in and take it. So they would actually be coding the excerpts that you selected. And then you'd get that Cohen's kappa statistic for each code. And we've made instructional videos that go step by step this process because it can be a little intimidating. So we'll link those in the chat too. Any questions? Anything anyone wants to see in here? I know we have about 10 minutes left.
There's a couple of comments in the chat, not so much questions, but comments. So maybe I'll just read those out whilst people may be wanting to add their other questions in the chat. So a comment from Stella. I was always interested in participating in ongoing projects that require coding of data, shadowing and learning from good practice. But it seems that this is not as easy as it sounds and would be nice to see more opportunities for collaboration and sharing good practice where possible. So I think you've shared some of those tips along the way. But interesting, the idea, sorry, that's my phone. Interesting, the idea about shadowing and learning from good practice. And I think that's something that I've certainly experienced when I've been, every team project's different, isn't it? And you always learn something new from how different people view the data and think about the data and handle the data. I don't know if either of you got anything to add to that.
Well, I think you bring up an important point, which is I really like to embrace the diversity in a team rather than impose sameness. I think it's really good to put in place processes where you're actually valuing people for their individuality and who they are, as long as people are working with the same goals and the same shared understandings of code books and those types of fundamentals. I think it's very important to embrace diversity intentionally, I think is the best way to say it.
It does depend where you're on the methodological spectrum, though, doesn't it? So like if you think about the methodological spectrum in terms of the paradigms that we have and the way that we view the world and the way that we view how research can be done on the kind of purist qualitative end, then I think what you say, Michelle, speaks to that space, doesn't it? But there are a bunch of people who are using qualitative materials who are coming from a much more positivist end, and that's where that whole inter-rater reliability side of things that Sarah was talking about comes from. And it's just different perspectives. And I don't know, I think we have to reflect as researchers and be open about where we sit with respect to those things.
Absolutely, without a doubt. I think it's absolutely fundamental to be able to say who you are and what you bring to the research. And often I don't think we talk about that enough.
No. There's a question from Erin in the chat. Can you see that one? Oh, you've just put a dedicated video just about that. Fabulous. Good code tree examples.
Well, this has come up a couple of times.
Yeah.
I don't think there is such a thing as a good code tree. I think there's a code tree that's fit for purpose is a good code tree. It's about every research project is going to be different. So I think I can give you tips. So the 7 tips before, maybe another tip might be I wouldn't go beyond 3 levels. So grandchildren, parents and grandparents. I think once you start getting to more than 3, you're starting to get very granular. That may be of importance to your research that you're doing. Personally, I've never gone beyond 3 levels in a code tree. But one of the tips I talked about is that not everything has to fit and be completely tidy. You can have things that sit at the top level, and that's okay. They don't have to have children and grandchildren. But I think one of the things I like in Dedoose is you can actually order how the codes sit. So you can create the code tree itself and order it in the way that makes sense to you. So you can still keep your thematic codes together, even if they're at the top level, for example. Gabriella's question is great. There are loads of resources in the literature about that. Who you are in the research. Yeah. Researcher as instrument is a massive topic. There's lots in the literature about it. And it's a really important point. It's what we were talking about with Christina just now, the idea that we all bring something different to the research. And I think if we had a project where we three were working on it, I think we may possibly come up with completely different outcomes because we have such different backgrounds. And that's okay, because as long as when you tell the story of the research, you're clear about who you are and your own lens that you're bringing to the research, I think it strengthens the outcomes.
I'm also curious, both Christina and Michelle, but the whole group, how are you navigating reviewers who are insisting on a more quantitative measure of trustworthiness, or do you encounter that? I know I've
counter-argued. I've had my work reviewed by obvious quants.
Mhm.
And some of the things that have been said have been quite helpful, but other things I think I've counter argued. And if you have if you're clear about what it is you're trying to say, I think it's important to say why their comments may not apply to this particular study and support that argument. And I've had some success with that and some failures, but I think it's important to stand up for who you are, I guess.
Yeah, I was curious if it's happening in other disciplines because I'm in the higher ed sociology space and I see it a lot.
I was just asked to review a massively quant paper, and I wrote back to the editor and said, I don't think it's appropriate for me to review this paper.
Right. So it's a crisis in how we review papers and in our system, I think.
Well, yeah, I think sometimes editors don't bring that into their consideration when they pick a reviewer.
And some folks asking for examples of code books and things of that nature. The chapter I have coming out, I think it should be out in the next couple months. I can forward that to Christina if she has a mailing list, and we can send that to you. It has an example of the actual code book that we had along with our code decision log. And it's a reflective piece. So we're reflecting on our process of establishing our code book, how we evaluated agreement, how we embraced disagreements as well.
You may be better just sharing an excerpt. I don't know if you'll be able to share the whole chapter with copyright.
Yeah.
So I can see we're coming to the end of the hour. Any questions before we wrap up or thoughts?
I've got one. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts, because I often come across teams who want to work inductively in generating their codes and in doing the analysis. And they sometimes are a little bit reluctant to the idea of planning. So you spoke at the beginning about planning and how important planning is. And sometimes there's this idea that that kind of purist qualitative analysis that is characterized by emergence and iterative kind of processes, kind of we have to that we can't plan that so well because we don't know what's going to happen, and that's half of the point. I just wondered whether you had any reflections on that, given that you put so much emphasis on planning, which I think is important too.
Well, I think in that instance, I'm talking more about protocols in place for managing the emergent code book. So one of the points I talked about was how do you manage flexible emergent design? And I think you can create protocols for how do you manage that. And yeah, I think it's one of those very tricky things, but you can certainly put a procedure in place so that people understand how do you do that. And one of the things I talked about was this idea of creating a separate space for creating new codes that aren't part of the approved code tree, if you like, and having regular meetings where the code master, where you talk about as a group, what's going on here, what are we actually seeing? Does it relate back to the focus of the study? Is it something to do with our research questions? Is it something that needs to be part of the code tree as we go? And I think all of those need to be discussed individually, building that idea of shared understandings and moving away from misconceptions. So yeah, it's tricky, but you can certainly have a process in place to manage that.
So planning doesn't need to constrain that flexibility. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Sarah.
No, you're fine. I've had success with familiarizing yourself with the data before it's in Dedoose or whatever tool you're using, because it's so easy to create codes and code online. I think people kind of go wild and create a bunch of codes just because it is so easy. But if you familiarize yourself with your data before you upload it, that can help get out some of those creative processes that are really helpful and help you start establishing codes that you're actually interested in, so that you don't have 20 codes that weren't useful to your study at all, but did help progress your thinking to getting somewhere that was helpful.
Yeah. We are coming to the end, but I think there's a really good question in the chat that I thought maybe you should speak to.
Yeah, I think there are different ways to to show that your research is robust. And I think, to me, the thing I look for as a reviewer is a really strong story arc, with showing how the evidence is connected to the research design, the research questions, the focus and purpose, how the findings are built from the different data sources, the different ways you can build tables to show that within your own paper. You can talk about the procedures in place for managing codes and developing codes as a team, that there's all sorts of things you can do to show that you have strong processes in place. But yeah, I'm not a great fan of Cohen's kappa. I think it's a very small piece of the whole process.
Yeah, it can be limiting. I want to know what behind the curtain of what your process was. And then I'm looking at the findings. Is what you're telling me supported by the data and your evidence? So sometimes I think that's the crux of the issue. Reviewers are looking at the methods section only for trustworthiness and credibility instead of the full story arc, like Michelle was talking about.
All right. Thank you so much. I found that really fascinating, and I think we can tell by the chat that everybody else did too. So thank you both so very much for giving up your time so generously to talk about these really important issues. I will be sending the recording to you all. Thank you very much for being here. Do check out all of the other recordings. There's some other great webinars on our YouTube channel, and do please tap into the next couple of webinars that we have coming up in September and October. And as I said earlier, tell us what you want to discuss more. And if you've been using digital tools or been thinking about them, then we'd love to hear from you all. So thank you very much for being here. I wish you all a good rest of your... Is it Monday? I don't even know what day of the week it is. I think it is Monday. Good. Have a good rest of your Monday, whether it's the end of the day or you're just beginning.
And see you on September 1st. Looking
Not
forward
at
to
9 o'clock in the morning UK time, no.
It'll be a bit early for you guys, but you can watch the recording afterwards.
that.